Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of the 1920s. Our question to think about: what were some of the reactionary elements of the 1920s? So again, when we think of the 1920s, we think of the growth, excitement, and changes captured in the popular images of the 1920s. But the 1920s also had a dark side, a reactionary element that vigorously opposed the changes taking place in American society and culture. The first sign of this reactionary element came immediately after the Great War was over. In November of 1917, in the middle of World War I, just 2 months before Woodrow Wilson presented his 14 points to Congress, Russian workers overthrew the provisional government of Alexander Kerensky. The one-party regime of the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, summoned workers everywhere to rise against their governments and make peace. The Bolsheviks took Russia out of the Great War in 1918, and they lost a fair amount of land to Germany in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This frees up Germany to concentrate on the Western Front. Woodrow Wilson is going to send 7,000 American troops to Russia to support an anti-Bolshevik force on the Eastern Front, and both the United States and Japanese forces invaded Siberia from the east. By the early 1920s, revolutions had spread beyond the Russian borders into Eastern Europe, and the like-minded governments came together to form the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, what we more commonly refer to as the Soviet Union. In the aftermath of the political chaos caused by Lenin's death, a new ruler would come to power in the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin. For the United States, the transition from a wartime to a peacetime economy is often bumpy and haphazard. The factories needed to shift their production from war materials to consumer goods, and the returning servicemen needed work, often displacing African Americans in the northern factories. Sometimes, however, the factories retained their black workers because they paid them less. In 1919, 4 million workers went on strike, and there were over 3,600 strikes in the United States in 1919 alone. The workers wanted higher wages and shorter work weeks, but critics linked them to the worldwide communist revolution. Because if Karl Marx says that the workers of the world should unite and rise up, having 3,600 strikes in just 1 year seems to suggest the workers are uniting and rising up. Many people in the country were jumpy because of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and there was a growing turn towards communism among American radicals, especially the foreign-born, which accelerated these fears. Now, in reality, there were probably about 60,000 communists in the United States in 1919. And most of the violence was the work of a lunatic fringe. But many Americans saw it all as Bolshevism, as a fear of Reds. It's important to understand that Americans seem to have this hysterical fear of communism. It's almost irrational, the degree to which they oppose communism. Communism seems to be so diametrically opposed to American democracy and capitalism that Americans become fanatical in resisting it. So the first Red Scare, and of course the word first there implies there's going to be a second Red Scare. The first Red Scare is a result of the Russian Revolution. In April of 1919, the post office intercepted nearly 40 homemade bombs addressed to prominent citizens, including A. Mitchell Palmer, who was the Attorney General. Many people thought this was the beginning of a communist takeover. So police raids in dozens of cities swept up thousands of suspects, many without warrants. And this represented one of the largest violations of civil liberties in American history. And because of his role essentially as the leading law enforcement agent in the country, A. Mitchell Palmer is going to lead much of this. So sometimes in textbooks, you'll see the Palmer raids as part of the first Red Scare. In May of 1919, Palmer rounded up nearly 4,000 suspects in a single evening. Federal agents broke into homes, into meeting halls, and union offices, again, without search warrants. The enthusiasm of the Red Scare would eventually fade into a more generalized reactionary element of the 1920s. In a nation where 1/3 of people were foreign-born, the attack on immigrants and the call for 100% Americanism took on a frightening zeal. There was concern that immigrants and their supposed radical political beliefs were threats to the established order. By 1920, immigrants had become the majority of factory workers, bringing the concern to an even higher level. Nicola Sacco and Bartholomew Vanzetti were arrested for robbery and murder in May of 1920, but they really become the poster children of the connection between immigration and the Red Scare. These two men, Sacco and Vanzetti, were self-proclaimed anarchists, and they faced a prosecutor and jury who condemned them more for their ideas than for any evidence of criminal conduct. The judge referred to them in court as, quote, those anarchist bastards. The men were convicted of both robbery and murder, and they made appeals of those convictions. And so this is something that's going to drag through the 1920s. And despite the public demonstrations on their behalf, on August 23, 1927, both men were executed in the electric chair. Their fate symbolized the bigotry and intolerance that had lasted throughout the 1920s. Nativism found its most successful outlet in the immigration legislation of the 1920s. The sharp increase in immigration in the late 19th century had led to a broad-based movement to restrict the flow of people from Europe. Some Americans were concerned that the end of the Great War would bring a flood of immigrants, the so-called barbarian horde or foreign tide, into the country, including, quote, dangerous and deadly enemies of the country. So the Emergency Immigration Act of 1921 is going to restrict European arrivals each year to 3% of the total of the 1910 census for that group. So the emergency in this name is the end of the Great War and the fear that a flood of immigrants from devastated Europe would be seeking shelter in the United States. So basing the numbers on the 1910 census, looking at how many people from that European nation came into the U.S. that year, and then allowing only 3% of that number to come in. But this wasn't good enough for some because it still allowed more than 500,000 Europeans to come into the country in 1923. And once again, most of them were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. So a follow-up immigration law comes into play. The National Origins Act is going to reduce the number to 2% and base it on the 1890 census. This is going to allow for more of the old immigrants rather than the new immigrants to come into the United States. In addition, the National Origins Act is going to completely exclude people from East Asia, a measure that passed Congress with overwhelming rural support. The act limited immigration from Europe to 150 a year and allocated the most spots to immigrants from Great Britain, Ireland, Germany, and Scandinavia. Surprisingly, the new laws did not restrict immigration from the Western Hemisphere, so Hispanics became the fastest growing ethnic minority, especially those from Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Mexican immigrants, as many as 100,000 per year, marked the strengthening of this element of our national ethnic mosaic, and it would continue to grow in size and influence until it becomes a major force in modern American society. The most ominous expression of protest against the new urban culture was the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. Remember that the Klan pretty much died out with redemption. Once white Southern men regained their political power, there was no need for these types of organizations to maintain the social hierarchy. The Second Klan, as it's sometimes called, was revived on Thanksgiving night, 1915, at Stone Mountain in Georgia. Colonel William J. Simmons and 34 followers founded the modern Klan. Membership grew slowly during the war, but after 1920, fueled by post-war fears and shrewd promotional techniques, the Klan memberships mushroomed. It thrived in small towns and cities in the North and especially the Midwest. In 1924, there were 35,000 Klansmen in Detroit. There were 55,000 Klansmen in Chicago, and the state with the largest Klan membership in the country, surprisingly, was Indiana. The Klan attracted the so-called respectable members of communities, especially those disturbed by immigrant and social and cultural changes in the 20th century. They attributed much of the tension and conflict in society to the pre-war flood of immigrants with different languages, religions, and social customs. Much of the Klan's appeal lay in the sanctuary it offered to people anxious about the direction of American society. By the mid-1920s, peak membership in the Klan may have been as high as 5 million, but influence declined after the 1924 immigration law. So in other words, once the Klan was able to accomplish major immigration restrictions, there was less popularity for the Klan, but also the publicity of Klan tactics, including kidnapping, lynching, and setting fire to churches and synagogues. In one case, they murdered a priest, led to a decline in membership. By 1930, membership in the Klan had dwindled to about 100,000. Related to all of this is a rise in religious fundamentalism, especially among Protestant Christians. Many Christian denominations in the United States had noticed a decline in membership after the Great War, and as a result, many churches attempt to appeal to the new modern attitudes of their constituents. But there's a pushback against the rise of modern Christianity and the modern secular society that had developed in the 1920s. Many religious fundamentalists supported the literal interpretations of the Christian Bible and opposed Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Tennessee was just one of the states that outlawed the teaching of evolution in public schools and colleges. This is the so-called Butler Act. In response, the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, called for volunteers to break the law and to challenge it in the courts. John Scopes was a high school biology teacher from Dayton, Tennessee, and he offered to teach the theory of evolution in his classroom and to be arrested for it. The trial takes on almost a circus atmosphere as people from all over the country traveled to the small town of Dayton, Tennessee to witness the trial. And of course, newspaper reporters were there in large numbers. In the end, it seems a little anticlimactic that John Scopes was convicted of violating the Butler Act and fined $100. But really, the Scopes trial, or the so-called monkey trial, really draws attention to the split. And in some cases, it's a very clear rural versus urban split, but it's a split between those who follow a more traditional value system versus those who are embracing modernism in American society. In December of 1919, Congress had passed the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages. In January of 1919, Nebraska became the necessary 36th state to ratify it, and prohibition became the law of the land. It took effect on January 16, 1920. Prohibition was deeply resented by German and Irish immigrants and was nearly completely ignored by the wealthy. The Volstead Act is the law passed by Congress that outlined the rules and regulations of prohibition, but of course it contained tons of loopholes. Ultimately, though, the consumption of alcohol did drop significantly in the United States, but it did have an unexpected result. Because alcohol could no longer be legally sold in the United States, there was a huge loss of revenue for the federal government, because if something cannot be legally sold in the United States, it cannot be taxed. So prohibition ultimately is going to breed a profound disrespect for the law. And because alcohol was no longer a legal business, it was taken over by organized crime. So illegal stills, rum running, and speakeasies became common, even popular, as the nation thumbed its nose at the prudish law. Bootlegging was big business, roughly $2 billion a year during the 13 years of Prohibition. The 1920s ushered America into the modern age, but the glamour, excitement, and prosperity covered up serious faults underneath the surface that would bring the entire thing crashing to the ground. So coming back to our questions to think about, what were some of the reactionary elements of the 1920s? So with the Russian Revolution, we see the rise of the Red Scare and the Palmer raids. This is strongly connected to nativism. Nativism is this anti-immigrant hostility and the fear that immigrants were bringing in radical political beliefs, including communism. This is also going to drive the rise of the Second Ku Klux Klan. The Klan in the South is still going to be an incredibly racist, violent organization. But in the Midwest, the focus is on opposing the influx of immigrants and maintaining traditional family values, which brings in religious fundamentalism for Protestant Christians during the 1920s. Now, Prohibition is an interesting case in the story of the 1920s because it comes out of the progressive era and the desire to improve American society. But it really expresses itself as an element of traditionalism in American society, where we're trying to tell people how to behave according to our standards, a more traditional religious standard.